Change management is something that comes up again and again and again in these conversations. And today we are so excited to have Tim Creasey and Paul Gonzalez from Prosci. These folks have been studying change management in organizations for the last 30 years. And today we're going to talk about how the timeless techniques of change management are being applied at the cutting edge of AI adoption today.
Hi, Tim Creasey, Chief Innovation Officer of Prosci. Excited to talk about the conditions of successful AI adoption, and here with Paul Gonzalez.
Thanks, Tim. I'm Paul Gonzalez, VP of Product at Prosci. Been working in technology and product for about 10 years now. And I'm excited to share what we're seeing with organizations and teams that are using some of the key change management tools and frameworks to drive successful AI transformation.
So maybe we just start there. So for folks who are normal listeners to our show and who don't know Prosci, give us a little teaser for why should they turn it up this week?
Very good. Thanks, Ed, and excited to be here. Prosci is at its core an organization focused on understanding why there's a pile of successful change and what pile of unsuccessful change. So founded by an engineer 25 years ago, just to start to explore what are the differentiators when we over deliver on change and outcomes and when we end up struggling. And sure enough, the people side of change was right there at the very top. So for as long as we've done change, we've designed, developed, and delivered great technical solutions, and then often wished and hoped that the other side of that change coin, where people engage, adopt, and use the solution actually comes to life. And so yeah, we put a bunch of science behind how do you put people in a position to succeed when you ask them to make change inside an organization.
So maybe we start with, why is change so difficult?
I mean, at its core, I guess I'll take this one, Tim, but inertia, right? Like I think at fundamentally, when it comes to why change is hard, is that people are hard, right? People have a lot of inertia. Organizations have inertia. And at the end of the day, there tends to be large parts of organizations that, I mean, as you think about, 10,000, 100,000 person organizations, a lot becomes like calcified and ossified about the way things operate. To make real change happen, a lot of times you have to sort of thaw that out and move people in a new direction. And that's just a tricky endeavor, right? Well, from the technical side, there's like requirements, you can sort of set them in, you can build your solution. There's no one sort of like resisting that. The technology you might fight with a little bit, but ultimately you can sort of control the outcome. When you think about changing behavior, there just tends to be a lot of baked in terms of systems, incentives, culture. All those things have like a massive amount of inertia. And at the core, that's really why change tends to be hard. And when it's done right, it can feel so magical, right? Because this is like a huge mountain to climb. That's really what Prosci has been working on for the last 30 years, is how do we help organizations have the right tools, frameworks, methods to make change a little bit easier. It's not going to be easy. It's still hard. But that's really at its core why it's so challenging. I don't know if you have anything else to add on that, Tim.
Well, I think this AI change is a fascinating, even a different type of change for organizations to navigate. And so Ethan Mollick talks a lot about the secret cyborgs, right? The folks that are sneaking AI into work in their pockets, while at the same time, we're watching enterprise AI deployments really struggle to gain traction. And so not only is change hard, human inertia and all the making sure we answer the questions people have when they have them. This particular change is really unique in terms of the individual and enterprise size of the coin, and how that's going.
I think a lot of folks are experiencing that for sure. A lot of the organizational leaders feel like this is a particularly gnarly change management effort. Why do you think that is? What's unique about the generative AI transformation?
Well, I think the first thing I'd start with is that nobody ever smuggled an ERP to work in their pocket before. Like the commercial accessibility or the consumer accessibility to the very top models is like nothing we've ever seen in comparison to a lot of the other technology deployments that were rolled out. And so I think that's one of the big changes. And then Paul talks a lot about just the pace of this change and what it truly means to the human side of organizational change.
Yeah, I think a lot of leaders that may not be taking change or change management all that seriously, a lot of times approach change as like a comms and training endeavor. Let's tell people what we're doing, and then let's give them training. If you just believe that's true, which by the way, we do not, at its very core, from a comms perspective, it is a tough message to deliver, right? If you're leaning in from a leadership perspective and just saying this is about cost, that's like not a really inspiring way for people to get on board.
Let's
You know,
go.
like,
Reduce costs.
why am I gonna
Woo!
like work myself out of this, right? And on the training side, I mean, when you look at the pace here, you look at things like, performance is doubling every 6 months. We're just not used to that type of pace of change of like transformation technology. So what that means is our old playbooks around, hey, we're gonna like, tell people what they need to do, and then we're gonna give them training on how to do the thing. Within 3 months, that might be obsolete, right? Everything's changed. I would have taught all this stuff about prompt engineering and chain of thought, and then all of a sudden reasoning comes around, or like, hey, you can't do this with image models, and now all of a sudden nano bananas around. Like, there's so much change that's happening that if you just take our old tactics around, comms and training, again, that's always been limiting, but certainly the pace is different here. So we need a different approach for how we like get people.
Do you think there's some reason why some people seem to be excited about this new stuff and kind of like see this as an opportunity, see an opportunity to learn, see the opportunity for getting more autonomy? And there are some people that seem almost kind of angry at it, where it's like, hey, this thing is coming from my job. I want to resist it. Is there a profile, or how do you think about that?
I think not necessarily. I don't know. I'm not sure about the profile of person. I think your first exposure matters. Like when you watch it truly do something that's value add above and beyond, give you a recipe for tomato soup in Snoop Dogg's voice. I think when you see people go into that moment of this is a partner for me to work with to achieve whatever it is I've set out to achieve, I think that's the moment when you see people kind of tip over.
I love that you go, when they see something of true value, tomatoes is in Snoop Dogg's voice. I'm with you
for the
on that
record,
one.
for the record, truly valuable.
Yeah.
I wonder, by the
It's
way, like just-
contextual, hyper personal, right? Because the thing about AI is it can do stuff hyper personally. It gives us the ability to actually get done what's right in front of us. And so when I ask it to teach me about MCP servers, I ask it to teach me in the terminology of barbecue grilling, because I grill a lot. And so like the ability to mash up different bodies of knowledge is, I think, one of those things that, I don't know, I leaned into it. And I think when you watch people mash up its capabilities and truly something they're trying to unlock, it's that hyper personal experience.
so you're kind of bringing in, we've heard what the bad is, right? Bad approach to change management is comms and training. If you could wave a magic wand and kind of prescribe what are the ingredients to bend the odds in the direction of success, what are the kind of, call it, top 3 or 4 key leverage points? Assume you have way too much demand, that you've got 1,000 less spots than customers are demanding, and you have the ability to sort through a customer list and say, we're going to take on one client this quarter that is primed for transformation. What are you looking for in terms of being primed for transformation?
So rather than wave a magic wand, we actually did research on this. So we did research with 1,107 participants, 500 frontline, 400 team leaders, 200 execs, and asked them all about how they were using AI, perceiving it being used in their organization, bringing it into their particular part of the organization. Then we looked at all of that data through the lens of what are the patterns that are emerging that demonstrate the conditions where you get successful AI deployment. Because there's a big pile of unsuccessful ones, but there was a pile of successful ones. And what are the conditions that really exist there? So we turned it into a bit of a diagnostic. But if I were to pick a couple of the ones right at the very top, leadership and bold AI vision. But what also came out of the research was a balanced vision. So a bold and balanced vision that really articulates how this technology will transform us, but also what we are doing in the near term to try to bring it to fruition. And I know even in some of the conversations with other guests, right, Paul, there's been like some real specific examples where we're hearing bold and balanced vision right in the conversation.
I mean,
Give us an example. What's an example of bold and balanced vision?
Well, I think there's a couple. First off, when you talk about like the code reds, right, that happen, like that's like from the top, right? Leaders at the top are really saying, okay, this is an urgent moment for us, and it's an urgent moment for the future of our organization, and we are going to attack it holistically. That means finding ways to use AI internally to, manage our organization more effectively, more efficiently. That means finding ways to use AI to solve customer problems in ways that we never could have historically, right? That means AI out for our customers, new products, new services, new offerings. So it really needs to be sort of balanced in that approach. It can't be, hey, we're just going to use it to like cut out a whole bunch of cost center costs, right? Again, not inspiring. So it really needs to be across that wheel of both internal, external use cases. And that allows people to sort of internalize, what's in it for me? How might it help my team? How might it help my department and my organization? And again, I think if you put the customer at the center, assuming you have a culture where people are bought into the fact that we are here to serve our customers in a meaningful way, that's part of what bold AI vision looks like. And I think, one of the things Tim brings up is that this is also not, while it is like very specific to AI adoption in this case, this is not new. Strong sponsorship at the top tends to be a leading indicator of transformation success. You know that, we all sort of know that. But sort of that key role that sponsors and leaders play to get their team on board and to sort of paint the vision of the future has always been an important part of change. But specifically when it relates to AI adoption, there's just a couple of different nuances, like this balanced approach, like this bolder vision, other than just, hey, we needed to cut costs.
Can we dive into the word balance for a second? Because I think bold everybody gets, but if I kind of like to think in terms of Goldilocks spectrums, right? So balance is kind of in the Goldilocks spot. I would say a little bit obvious on one end of the spectrum, which is this is all about efficiency and productivity, and we're going to do, it's only going to take 10% of what it used to, right? So we get that. What's on the other end? What should be equally avoided as just leading with productivity?
The other balance I would, in addition to kind of the content or the topic, I think there's a time frame dimension around balance. And we're talking about the near-term work we're doing, the wins we're having, the experiments that we're promoting, the pilots that we are shutting down intentionally on purpose so that we can put our focus where we need to. And we're also talking about what we're going to look like in 3 years as an AI-infused organization, where all of the work that we do in zeros and ones ultimately is up for grabs to be touched or disrupted by this new technology. And so leaders are, from a balance perspective, are talking both about opportunity and efficiency AI, and also near-term impact and long-term vision.
On a very practical level, as you're advising companies that want to do this, and we talk about getting the leadership involved, I get the sense that there's a lot of CEOs and board members that are very big on getting kind of the AI curve efficiency up in the organization. Then sometimes it could be more challenging, even the senior management, let alone the middle management. As you kind of see successful kind of implementation, how important is it that you have top and then all the way through the organization? Or can you have like sporadic kind of like bright lights that you can build on?
I think, and it was interesting, Jeremy asked about like what metric we might use to decide if this organization is set up to succeed. And the one that came to my head, and I'll have Paul talk a little bit about it, is exposure hours of the executive team. If you could give me literally a measure of how many hours executive team has spent with their fingers on the keyboards, not talking about AI, not just listening to AI, but actually pushing the boundaries, pushing the buttons, I would put my money, that might be the metric I would use to decide if this is going to be and so Paul exposed me to the notion of exposure hours. But I think when we talk about what's different for AI change and leaders, I think this is a key piece.
Yeah, I think it matters a lot. And to your point, Henrik, we think about how that cascades down the organization. I think there could be a few bright lights in terms of champions and how that plays out. I do think at some point you end up with a bit of like a Swiss cheese state at the end of this transformation, which is that if there are certain department leaders that are resisting it, certainly if they're openly resisting it in some capacity, that's going to be a problem for how that then cascades down within their departments. That is like a known challenge. So I do think it starts at the top. It starts at the executive team level. I do think you need to build a strong sponsor coalition across that sort of middle layer of the organization. Champions can carry things, but it's also not their job necessarily to champion this across the whole organization. And I think to Tim's point, the amount that those leaders are engaged with using AI themselves tends to be a good insight, just because they start to see patterns, they start to see what use cases might be tailored for their teams. To me, that's like some of the leading indicators that you see. So I think you really need to think about holistically enabling your leadership level, executives and that sort of key sponsor coalition level with at least some AI literacy, AI foundations, so that they can start to pattern match, right? How it might apply to their team specifically.
Okay, so we've covered the first one, bold AI vision. Going back to this question of what are the 3 or 4 kind of leverage points you're looking for? What's another or a key indicator of readiness for transformation? What's the next one?
Next one, I think, is really around that kind of people side and the experimentation culture. So the organization encourages employees at all levels to experiment with AI tools, share insights, and learn from small failures. That was kind of the statement that came out of the research. And again, we started to see the success pile was not just decreeing experimentation, but was creating a system, the conditions, the structure to encourage that rapid learning, sharing, kind of within and across the folks that are really doing the work.
So how do you build that system? I mean, that feels like on the one hand, you go, it's either present or it's not, pre-AI or not. Now, say an organization goes, okay, we need to build an environment where experimentation can be encouraged and unleashed. Are there ways to establish or to cultivate a culture of experimentation if it's not present?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that come to mind for me there, Jeremy. First off, I think I was talking to one leader and they were bringing up Toby's like Shopify memo about like how we're going to move in this direction. And they're like, we need something like that. Like that would not work here. Right? Like the way you've hired, the way you've built the organization is really around a builder's mentality. It's a lot of experimentation baked into the culture. That's not going to be the right like option. You can't just jump to that in an organization. So to me, there's like a few things really, Jeremy, that I think about. First off, it's really disingenuous in my mind to say like, hey, just start experimenting, right? If you haven't built that culture within the company, it's not what's rewarded. It's not what's incentivized. Hey, take some time to fail or try things. Like, that's just not baked in. I do think you have to carve out some time specifically within teams on very low stakes things, right? If you say, hey, let's do a hackathon to solve this one problem that's an actual problem we have, people are already like, am I going to get this wrong? Am I going to get this right? I think it's almost better to find some time that's almost completely unrelated, just so that they can start to use and try out the tools. I also think you need to, in these moments, take an opportunity to broaden out the tool set that people are trying within AI to sort of see the art of the possible. If there are just sort of enterprise AI tools that they're using, maybe they're not getting exposed to some of the prototyping tools to try things out, right? Hey, did you even know that you could build your own landing page or build your own app or do deep research on a topic? So I think as you start to lower the stakes on how they're experimenting with it, give them some space to try things that are maybe not directly even related to like a problem they have. It starts to create a little bit more psychological safety around trying something crazy, failing a little bit to sort of build that culture in.
Have you seen other examples? We've talked to a lot of folks that have done hackathons.
Yeah.
We've done a lot of CEOs who have like a session where they do show and tell, or they kind of like share the other team. For some of the organization I'm involved, like their Loom is being used a lot to kind of like show a different example. In an effort to try to create like, I would say like excitement and like entertainment out of like this, have you seen other tools that people are using just to kind of like get the excitement level out so it becomes as much about like, here's cool thing you can do with it that makes you or your customer kind of having a better experience rather than just, here's the thing that will make your job for you?
Yeah, I mean, just one small example, even internally at Prosci, I don't think everyone had known about what you could do in Claude with like artifacts as an example. Someone on our sales team turned in like, or they were sort of sharing out the pipeline, how that was progressing. They built like a bit of like Claude artifact, like small app to showcase that. Like what a great way to actually experiment, try something, and then show it to the rest of the team. And they're like, hey, how'd you do that? How does this play out? So I think there's some of that, Henrik,
And that was through Slack, or was that through like an all hands, or what's it actually kind of like
the mechanism?
Yeah, in that
itself,
regard, we have like a weekly email where they're sending stuff out for what's going on with the pipeline. And in that email, all of a sudden I see this Claude artifact. I'm like, oh, what is that? So
cool.
Again, that's something that as an email I would typically read anyway. But when I see this new way to expose the data, the content, bring it to life in an interesting way. And now I'm going out to that person and saying, hey, that was interesting. Like, are other people in your team aware of this possibility? How might we sort of bring that other places? I think there's like again, to me, that's like a bit of a novel, at least internally at Prosci was, way to share that out.
Now, one of the things I wonder is where does experimentation live?
Mm.
One thought is we're all experimenters, and everybody's experimenting, right? Which is, you call it building culture, whatever. The other thought is more of there is a team that's dedicated to AI experimentation. I think we had Adam and Andy who wrote AI First on recently, and they kind of reference Ethan's interview with them as in the kind of, the last chapter of the book. I read the book after our interview with them, which I enjoyed. And one of the things that Ethan talks about is establishing an AI R&D lab, that every organization needs an AI R&D lab. And to me, that shows the way towards a little bit different structure, which is it's not everybody's job to experiment. It's this lab's, I mean, I don't know how you define lab, but can you talk about whether experimentation has to be kind of broadly distributed or centralized?
Yeah, I don't think there's a reason to veer off of Ethan's framework too much, because I think it makes sense. And the important part to add to that is that in his framework, it's not just the lab, right? There's leaders, the lab, and the crowd that are all working together to create this AI transformation. I think the lab is going to be that area where those are the people that, as GPT-5 is released, as Nano Banana is released, are on the frontier seeing what might be possible. But you still need access to the crowd of like employees broadly to see how that might actually apply to drive outcomes for the business, right? Like you need to still have access to people who are dealing with problems on a day-to-day basis with customers that are trying to get through a process, that are trying to build a new solution or something that can then like push the learnings from the lab into the crowd to actually see if it's making an impact on the business. So I definitely like the idea of like, I don't expect every employee everywhere to be up to date on the latest and greatest from AI and what's possible. I mean, us four are probably in the weeds way more than others, and I don't even know if we can keep up with all the change. So it's disingenuous to assume that employees can. So I like, in that regard, keeping sort of a centralized lab to experiment with the latest and greatest. But you still need to get it out to the edges of the organization to see the impact of how it's going to actually impact the organization's day-to-day or customer outcomes in some new way. So that.
Can I ask a little bit on the impact? I mean, like if you look at just, let's take BarkBox that obviously is very involved. We seem to have gone through these like two phases and going into the third phase. The first one is kind of how do you get the coefficient up? How do you get the crowd involved? How do you get the lab up and running? I would say the fundamentals. And then I think we've been through a phase where we're like, okay, let's figure out like how do we basically create an agentic kind of like framework for a lot of the different organizations. So how do we take, like everything from supply chain to HR, and we create, different agents that can either enhance what that organization is doing or make it for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
The third phase seemed to be this kind of like emerging kind of like new architecture that almost need to be of the organizational design.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I don't see is that we're just replacing kind of FTEs with agents. What I'm seeing is that suddenly the designer can do a little bit of the marketeer's job because, they can do something, but they can also write a little bit more, basically like the narrative around like a toy character, for example, right? Or the supply chain could do a little bit of like the planner's people. And so the FTE reduction is probably not going to be like, and suddenly we'll just remove people that. It is that there's like this new patchwork kind of like emerging where people can, if they're allowed to, do other people's job. And that would suggest to me that kind of like the third and final maybe phase, at least the third phase, would be that actually like a little bit static org chart that I guess in many ways was designed for when we did railroads in the US in the late 18th century, right? Like is kind of like being in many ways displaced. By this thesis, and two, how do you feel people start to do the leaps from kind of like phase one to at least phase two, or at least phase two to phase three, as we obviously are also seeing like a lot of kind of writing about people who think they're doing a lot of like the phase one stuff, but they're not really seeing the returns and therefore getting increasingly frustrated.
I'm pretty aligned with kind of your high premise. I think very early on, I got exposed to a website. It was called There's an AI for That. And it was essentially just a big library of AI tools, but it was organized around different jobs. And when you clicked into a job, it gave the tasks. that job executed where AI could augment. And that was kind of a moment to me to realize I think the task is the denominator here. The task is what we pile together to make jobs. We string tasks together to make workflows. We string tasks together in project plans to make projects. I think if we start to actually break down the work an organization does into the tasks, we can start to reassemble and redesign the org in really neat new ways. And I think you're right that AI expertise and capabilities has enabled folks to start to expand into some different tasks that they might not have necessarily extended into before. It does take a huge role in redesigning what work actually means in the organization. And there's even this, the notion of the work chart that you're starting to hear talked about above and beyond an org chart, but really looking at the assembly of tasks to achieve the outcomes that we as an organization are setting out to. And then which of those tasks do we want to keep human? Which of those tasks can we agentify and automate? And then which of those tasks do we bring together in sort of an augmented fashion?
And how far do you think we are from like these new type of organization designs that are more agentic? I seem from the startup side, we seem to be seeing it more and more because you start to see companies that are kind of built from their AI kind of like from inception. So when do you think we'll start to see this not just happening in the startup side of things, but like happening in organizations that you advise, for example?
Yeah, I think in the next couple of years, you'll start to see things where, let's say like a new product line is spun up. You might take this approach right out of the gate on like a new product. So as an example, like even in Prosci, we're launching some new products. The team stack feels very different as we're starting to invest and build there, just because there's much more of like a IC, super IC sort of focus where people can do more with their current skill set and sort of bleed into other things. I think the bigger change, Henrik, honestly, around that as we move forward will be how do organizations align incentives, align career ladders, align compensation? Because there's a lot changing. In my view, this is actually the bigger change for organizations than the technical side over the next 2 to 3 years, because it is incredibly disruptive when we start thinking about what's going to happen, where they're going to get disrupted from the startup space. Companies that are so small, moving so fast, having such big impact. A lot of that is how they're organized and structured, like in terms of their teams. I think you'll start to see it in the enterprise in the next year or so around smaller teams, maybe doing smaller pockets of work, launching new products, whatever the case is. But as whole organizations have to shift into this new sort of era, that requires change in compensation, change in reporting structures, people giving up power. This is like a much slower change. And the likelihood that happens across, first of all, organizations is very low, right? Ultimately, things will sort of, just get disrupted out. But I think you'll see it more spin up for like individual product lines or individual areas to operate in this new way, to start to tease out how that'll play out. And I think that's right in front of us. I think that's, within the next year or so, you'll start to see that for sure.
Are there any examples of organizations that are moving in that direction, more established enterprises who are starting to employ disruptive models or even differential approaches to innovation? Who should we be looking to or learning from?
One thing that I might throw in there that I've been thinking about is the difference between the U.S. military and the Navy SEALs. And so I've been thinking kind of like, I don't have a background in warfare, but like I was thinking about the other day that you kind of seem to have had like a way that battles have changed. Like you used to have like these like big armies that was very much like these classic kind of companies. And increasingly you have like the SEAL team kind of like approach where you put 7 people, you say, hey, they report straight in the US, the SEAL team reports straight to the president. They get like an objective and they basically have like unlimited resources to figure out how to fix it.
Uh-huh.
And it does seem to me that there might be a future where organizational design look more like SEAL teams than on armies because of the change of nature of work, but also because that the AI is going to democratize the ability to create products and services. So you just need to be able to operate at a much higher velocity than you used to, where you could say, hey, here's an idea, let's productize it, then put it on the factory line, and then have people basically create like these different parts of the process. You might have to kind of like, reinvent that thesis statement.
I keep thinking about the culture question. And I remember reading one time, it takes like half the age of the organization to fundamentally change its culture. So a 40-year-old company, it's going to take 20 years to fundamentally shift the culture. And So I think it's going to take intentionality to continue to make the changes that we expect to see in organizations. A lot of org structure was established to support decision making and dissemination of information. Like dissemination of information is such a critical component of all this. And that was why we had to structure that way. And I think through the digitization in the last 10, 15 years, decision making, dissemination of information are things that we now have, at our fingertips. And so I think you're right. We need to rewrite the rules of, organizations create value in a lot of different ways today than they used to. And we need to start to organize ourselves around some of that.
I want to go back to kind of change management as a practice, as a science, because I feel like we just dove straight into AI, and straight into now. But Prosci has been doing this for 30 years. So I want to, maybe as we kind of wrap the conversation, I want to zoom out to what are the unchanging truths of change management that leaders and organizations can anchor on? What do you know? There are timeless foundational principles that transcend the particular technology that you can say, this principle, I can land on this.
Nice. I'd offer up one first, and that's that organizational change ultimately happens one person at a time. That is individuals doing things differently collectively that actually enables big organizational shift. And so in the end, it's helping each person who has to more confidently and competently integrate AI into their day-to-day work. It's helping that person through their own personal journey of understanding why and deciding to, knowing how to, and really bringing it to life in the way that they do their work. So I think that would be one of my principles. And then my other would be, we've done 12 longitudinal research studies over 25 years. Every single time when we asked about the top contributor to successful change, it was active and visible participation by our senior leaders. And so that active and visible role of sponsors, which gets tricky because we're trying to facilitate that experimentation and that grassroots adoption. But at the same time, we know to get enterprise lift, we're going to need active and visible sponsorship, not just from that single senior leader, but from that coalition of leaders. And especially as agents tie the organization more closely together, we're going to need even stronger alignment around that coalition. So,
okay, active and visible. Please pontificate on the paradox
of active and visible in today's experimental nature.
No, active and invisible.
Oh, no, active and visible.
Oh, if that was unclear to me, I hope that I helped at least one listener. Tim is not advocating for active and invisible leadership.
That would be the launch and leave
how does
sponsor,
a leader achieve
which is
that?
a known issue. Yeah. You don't want to
sign the check, sign the charter, come back for the pizza party at the end. Yeah.
And visible. Okay.
Active.
That makes
and
far
visible.
more sense.
What you guys done a lot of research on these things? What are other kind of like things that people listening to this can kind of like grab from your research?
I'm going to just sort of, it's a great lead in there, Henrik, and I'll tie some of the things Tim just said together. For me, I still think one of our biggest contributions to how change happens successfully, again, Tim mentioned, happens at the individual level. And we always see active and visible sponsorship as one of the key leading indicators. ADKAR, I actually have a book back here with it. But that's sort of the key framework that or model that we have, or one of them at least, that really helps sort of track how individuals change behavior, change within an organization. It's really about, do they have awareness for the need for change? Do they have the desire to participate in that change? Do they have knowledge? Do they have ability? And do we have reinforcement mechanisms built in to keeping this change to stick? And you kind of see how then active and visible sponsorship might matter, right? Or might tie to those things. Have sponsors laid out a vision, a mission, a goal that it's inspired people to build that awareness and desire? Have they put enough investment and resources on helping to maintain and build knowledge and ability and reinforce it? So that's like, when I think about like tactical thing to use, you can view a lot of people side problems through the ADKAR lens to understand where people might get stuck on any given change. And all the things we've been talking about today around bold vision, the culture of experimentation, you could sort of start to see how those might map into ADKAR specifically. The other key thing that I think is really like pressing in this moment, especially, is when we look at sort of the leading people side indicators of hitting those project objectives, we think about the metrics in sort of 3 buckets. There is the speed of adoption. How quickly do they adopt the new solution? There is ultimate utilization. Are they sticking with it? And then there is proficiency, like how well are they using the new solution? And I think on one of your actually recent podcast episodes, you were talking about how you were talking to a leader and they're like, we have 100% adoption. Like everyone's used it. It's like, okay, that might be the speed of adoption, but that's not ultimate utilization or proficiency. That is such like a pressing thing now because proficiency around using generative AI technologies is just a different type of proficiency than could you click through the ERP to generate an invoice, or do we know how we're going to like roll out this new compensation structure? So if the proficiency matters a lot here, and again, if we support our people through that change, again, viewing it through ADKAR, you sort of get all of those. We call them our sub metrics: speed of adoption, utilization, proficiency. You got to hit all those sub metrics to ultimately get the benefits you're looking for. So those are 2 things that I think are super useful and tactical that people can take away.
Can we talk for a second about one of our kind of curiosities is the resistors or the folks who are holdouts, just using your SUP metrics as kind of a proxy here. What do you do for the person who is slow, who is low utilization or low proficiency? How do you think, or how have you learned in regards to change management to deal with that person? How much patience do you give them? How much leash do you give them? And then ultimately, when do you decide if you're not, for example, with the ERP system, if you're a holdout, at some point, you're not going to be successful here.
Yeah.
How do leaders think about the resistant and the slow?
Yeah, I think I heard recently, I forget who mentioned this. Maybe it was Brian Belfour from Reforge. He was talking about AI change specifically, but he was talking about catalysts, converts, and anchors. And how do you sort of address each of them? And this maps so well to how we think about helping people through this change. I think first and foremost, when we think about change management, it's really about how do we help support each of our employees in a respectful way that helps them get to where they need to go. I think you have to provide the right mechanisms, Jeremy, to do that, right? Are you giving them adequate training, support? Are you giving them the right ability to try it? Or if you're just saying, hey, do this new thing, and that's added on to your existing thing, is that really a fair shot? I think the other important part is like, it doesn't require every single employee all the time to make the change to get the full benefits. I do think as culture shifts and people move in that direction, they might self-select out. I think at some point you might have to make exit decisions, of course, but there are some anchors that ultimately, as a people manager, as a leader, you'll make sure that they have the right tools, mechanisms to move in that direction. But at some point, the natural state is that the current state of the organization and where it's moving is no longer fit for what they're looking for in their role. And that's just like one of the hard parts of change for sure.
And this is where the ADKAR model that Paul brought up is also really helpful to truly understand like the root cause of where the resistance is coming from, because not all resistance is created equal, right? So does this person understand why and why now and the risk of not changing? Have they made that personal decision? Do they understand what's in it for them and what's in it for the organization and the motivators? Have they been provided adequate training and skills, the knowledge that they need? Have they been given the space and the coaching to overcome whatever ability barriers they might have run into? And do they believe that if they go through the effort to make the change, we're actually going to stick with it? And it's worth sticking to and not kind of regressing back to the old way of doing things. And it helps us isolate and understand where might this change get stuck moving forward. Our research shows that the top reason identified for resistance and organizational change is that very first building block, a lack of awareness of the need for change. We never made a compelling case above and beyond this thing is coming, but we didn't connect that into what does it mean to our ability to transform and deliver on our mission that we couldn't have before trying to make this change.
And you're saying that's the top reason for resistance is the person doesn't understand why it's so important.
Nobody made a compelling case for why this change is happening yet. And that's from our historic research. Yeah.
I think what's an interesting point though, and I think what you guys brought up earlier, which, like it's obvious, but I hadn't thought about it this way before, is that I think CEOs often make a compelling case of why this makes sense for the company.
Correct.
I think what you mentioned earlier was basically how do you get down to like the individual? of like, why does this make sense for you? Or maybe even by proxy saying, how does it make sense for the customer? Because I'm sure most staff, they get excited about that. But what we've heard, Jeremy, I think a lot of these conversations is that people go like, hey, we need this because the world is a nasty place. Everything is going faster. Like we need to blah, blah. But not like at that next level, which I think is an interesting and compelling kind of argument.
Yeah, I think an important gap there too, Henrik, is as we think about how we see successful change happen in organizations, part of it's like process, like how do we approach the change management of this transformation? But a huge part of it is like activating your leaders throughout the organization. So we talk about the CEO, we talk about those top sort of sponsor coalition members, setting that bold vision, having that cascade down through the organization. But it needs to cascade down, right, to people managers, right? If my manager is not helping personalize that message for our team and for me, it's very hard for me then to go back to listen up to what the CEO might have put out there as like the reason why we're changing. So you need to really make sure that your sponsor coalition, people managers are all sort of aligned to the messaging, and they can help sort of tailor it to the individuals as it cascades down the organization. We tend to see that be a bit of a gap, right? We started here, we know we have to get it to employees. The employees are listening to the CEO's message, but it needs to sort of like come down. Again, Tim can speak to the historical research on this, but we talk a lot about preferred senders. Who is the key person that needs to be delivering this message so that the receiver can internalize it and hear it correctly? This speaks to that sort of challenge, Henrik, which is that you really want to see how it's going to impact them directly from the people manager of that person. And that requires a whole lot of activation across an organization to make sure people managers can sort of connect that back.
What are the hallmarks of a preferred sender? How do you identify the preferred senders in the organization?
Yeah, so the research we asked in terms of questions around organizational enterprise business impact, who do you want to hear those messages from? And from the research said, employees want to hear that message from the people at the top, somebody at the top of the organization sending those strategic level messages. When it comes to who employees want to hear the messages about how it impacts me and my team and my day-to-day work and my own aspirations and goals and challenges and fears, I want to hear those messages from the person I report to, my immediate manager. And so you end up with these two critical employee-facing roles in times of change. The person at the top communicating that enterprise-level messaging, and then, as Paul alluded to, really activating the people managers throughout the organization to effectively coach, advocate for, and support their direct reports.
And this hasn't showed up in our research yet, Tim, and now we're riffing and see how this plays out. But I feel like, especially in today's world, as we think about that preferred sender and the people manager, I feel like especially in AI change as an example, we're talking a lot about these champions or these change agents. There's a bit of like, there are influencers in an organization that just have gravity around certain changes and how the organization's moving. I think as you identify those and you use those individuals to share how is it impacting their job, how are they doing things differently, I think that's like another sort of lever that leaders and organizations can pull to sort of have the change stick. At some point, it's like, okay, I heard it from the CEO, I heard it from a manager. Now I want to hear it from my influential peer that's actually doing their job differently, more effectively, more efficiently. That is like another important lever that you sort of see. And it manifests itself in all different ways. You might have people come to town halls or team meetings and sort of do a share out of how they're using sorts of things. So I think these are other sort of catalysts you can lean on to help move employees in a certain direction in order to get that change adopted at scale.
I wrote down a very nerdy phrase in my notes just now, which is we got to shrink the attenuation function. And what I mean by that is when you talk about the alignment between whether it's the sponsor and the coalition and the managers, what is the attenuation rate, or how much is that message weakened as it, like I'm thinking back to the old days of Bell Labs, right? And they're trying to get like telephone messages across thousands of miles. It really matters, every percentage, decrease over a mile has dramatic implications at how clearly the message gets communicated. I wonder whether leaders are optimizing for attenuation, again, to get really nerdy here. But if the message has to be clear enough that it can be handed off several layers without a reduction in potency, that requires a very, very tight and clear message from the top, which it's one thing. Do I get it when the CEO says it? That's a different
Yes.
question then. Is this a transferable message
Yeah.
that can survive several layers of cascading?
I think that's a good point to stop also because we're running out of time.
That last comment, there's like a good half hour about the difference between biological knowledge and explanatory knowledge. Like we could get into the notion of generational atrophy of explanatory knowledge in a really fun way. That was a very meaty way to
That
sign
sounds
off.
like
But thank you very
That
much.
sounds like Jeremy and you kind of conversation.
I think Tim's just trying to have a more nerdy phrase, generational atrophy. It's like, that's like a whole other level there.
I know where I was when I listened to this podcast at one point that talked about biological knowledge and explanatory knowledge.
Okay, well, give us like the 30-second, just if we don't have hours. But somebody's like, wait, do I have to listen to a whole other podcast? What's the TLDR, Tim? Come
So
on.
biological knowledge lives in your cells. It gets passed cell to cell. It's built up over years, and it tells your cells how to work. So it's why salmon know to swim back upstream when it's time to lay their eggs. Explanatory knowledge lives in your brain, and we as humans started to create it so that we could make sense of our physical experiences. So the first time we looked up in the sky and we saw stars, we had to come up with an explanation for that because otherwise it's too hard to look at that and not. So we made up explanations for what those things were. And then as science and our understanding grows, we begin to have real explanations for a lot of our exploratory experiences. But humans we are driven to have explanatory knowledge. So if we have an experience we can't explain, we got to come up with a way to fill it in. But generational is how biological knowledge gets passed, and that's why you get preferred traits. Explanatory knowledge also gets passed. And how well the message got constructed, how effectively it can be internalized, that enables explanatory knowledge to be passed at a high level of fidelity or one that starts to kind of erode over time, which is exactly what you were starting to talk about when you were talking about message.
Tim, what Tim is getting at here is we do not want an AI dark ages. I think that's what Tim is getting at.
It's also there's an insight to what it's like to work with Tim. Oh,
yeah.
Daily basis. So
that's it. And folks, if you're interested in applying for a job at Prosci, you can reach out to Tim no, I'm kidding. That's great.
While we have one more second, Paul exposed me to GPT-3.5 on December 2nd, 2022. And some other time, I'll tell you the story about the video I got from him, but how it was a pivotal moment of providing hyper contextuality, of getting to watch what this really means to the work we do. So
that's cool. You're saying that Paul designed his message for minimal atrophy.
100%.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Brilliant,
This was a really cool conversation. Thank you. Really, really appreciate it.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for the
Thanks for
time.
having us, Jeremy and Henrik.
So, Henrik, what stood out to you,
Yes.
my friend?
You know what? There's a lot. I mean, like, it's always intriguing when people do proper research because obviously they then take all their different insights and kind of package them up in these to understand ways. So I thought
ADKAR.
a lot of it was fascinating, right? I do think exposure hour was one thing that I thought was interesting. Like as a measurement, we don't talk too much about what is actually things that you can measure to make sure AI get better introduced into your organization. I thought that was very interesting. I thought, like, as I mentioned also when we talked to them, that I think a lot of people probably fail to tell staff, why does this make sense to you? Or why does this make sense to the customer? I think there's a lot of like, we have to do this because it makes sense to the company. And, you know, being somebody who's customer centric as a founder, like it's just obvious that that seemed to be like a thing that we probably don't do a good enough job as a collective kind of like AI into organization crew.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the last one, because there are always three things, like really the bold and balance, right? This idea that you need like a statement of why this is important, but you also kind of, I like the balance approach of like, how do we get going right away? Something to make it a little bit less lofty. I thought was kind of like also new and interesting.
Yeah, I agree with you there that this idea of the attenuation function or the atrophy of knowledge, but thinking about the message that is relatable to your point to the individual. I really like the insight. I think that it resonates with me, especially in the age of AI, that kind of the singular most important piece of knowledge about change management is that ultimately it comes down to individuals That's the first thing. That makes a lot of sense to me. And then the insight that the top reason historically about why people resist change is that no one ever made a compelling case for why it's happening. I think is a really, it's so, in a way you could say it's obvious, and yet in a way it's really profound that the people who resist not because they're malevolent or malicious, but because they haven't been convinced this really matters. And I think if a leader said, my job is to make the compelling case, why does this matter to this person? Now, if I do my job and they still resist, that, okay, great, they're voting, right? But it's really easy to dismiss resistors rather than take responsibility for, I have yet to make the compelling case for why they should no longer resist.
Yep. No, I think that is a very, very, very good point.
I'm also just relieved to realize that they were not saying leaders need to take an active, invisible role because that was
like,
so
I heard
confusing to
invisible
me.
too. I was like, this still storming? Like, is this like, how to
Yeah.
do that? And I thought it was so
Okay, so I
fascinating.
wasn't crazy. I'm like, what? And
No.
then he said active and visible, dude,
Uh,
and visible.
I had the
That
same
was
thing
that
too.
was funny.
I do think it's also interesting how important it is to get, I think, the whole management team involved, because to the point about having to explain to each individual by their manager why this is important, you kind of need like the whole chain to kind of like agree that this is important and why, and then make sure that obviously that they can form the argument in a way that makes it compelling. But I definitely see a lot of organizations where there are different kind of like holes in the organization of
in the chain.
people.
Yeah.
Where basically like some manager goes like, oh yeah, I'm good enough to not have to bother about this.
It's interesting if you think about that kind of attenuation function, any gap in that chain is the message that I receive as a frontline employee. Say there's kind of 5 levels between me and the CEO, right? It's a very flat organization, right? But say there's 5 levels. If the manager level 4 doesn't have conviction, the net effect to me in the front line is no conviction, which is to say there could be 4 layers of high conviction that are totally diluted by a single individual which lacks it. And so even one way to think about it is almost interrogating that chain of command, or interrogating the relay channel to understand, where is this message being diluted? It may just be in a single kind of critical communication node that's actually affecting a unexpectedly big part of the organization, disproportionate.
I think that's it. So do you want to come up with a code word?
Code word, attenuation.
I don't even know how to spell it, so I'm hoping somebody else does.
Just look in the comments, my friend. You're going to see it all over the place. If you've enjoyed this episode, what should they do, Henrik, if they enjoyed this episode?
They should scream it from the top of their lungs. They should
Just go outside right now. Just go outside and say, "Beyond the proud." Is that what they should do? Okay. Yeah, exactly.
They should like, they should subscribe, they should share it, they should comment, they should link them, they should do all these different things.
Scrawl it on the jail cell walls. That's
No,
right.
but you know
Thank
what some people do that actually means a lot to they write on LinkedIn something that they've heard in the podcast that they really enjoyed. And that makes us incredibly happy. So if you heard something that you thought stood out, write a LinkedIn post and tag us, then it will make our day.
Hearts, emojis.
Bye.
Bye.